Sarah stood at the edge of Emma's crib, mesmerized by the gentle rise and fall of her daughter's chest. In the soft glow of the butterfly nightlight, the 2-week-old infant's delicate features seemed almost ethereal. A light dusting of dark hair crowned her head, and her tiny fingers were curled into perfect fists beside her face. Sarah reached down to adjust the swaddled blanket, careful not to disturb the precious sleep that had taken so long to achieve. Outside, snow drifted past the nursery window, adding to the thick white blanket that had covered their suburban neighborhood for the past week. The winter storm had provided a perfect excuse for the isolation Sarah secretly craved. After 36 hours of labor and an emergency C-section, she'd imagined spending these first few weeks in a peaceful cocoon with her daughter, learning the intricate dance of motherhood at her own pace. Reality, however, had other plans. Her phone buzzed again, the 6th text message in the past hour. This time it was her sister-in-law, Angela. The roads are finally clear. Can't wait to come meet my niece tomorrow. Sarah's stomach tightened as she thought about yet another person wanting to hold Emma, to kiss her, to pass her around like a precious doll. The first few days after bringing Emma home had been a parade of well-wishers, each one insisting on their right to hold the baby. "Oh, come on, just for a minute," they'd say. Or worse, "Don't be one of those overprotective mothers." Her own mother-in-law had scoffed at Sarah's request for visitors to wash their hands, calling it city nonsense and reminding everyone within earshot how she'd raised 3 healthy children without all this modern paranoia. Sarah's fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard, trying to craft a response that wouldn't offend. At 35, she'd come to motherhood later than most of her friends, after years of focusing on her career as a software developer. The pregnancy itself had been a small miracle after 2 years of trying, and every moment since Emma's birth felt both precious and precarious. A soft whimper from the crib drew her attention back to Emma. The baby's face scrunched slightly before relaxing again into sleep. Sarah's heart swelled with an almost painful love, accompanied by that fierce protective instinct that had surprised her with its intensity since becoming a mother. She knew what people said behind her back, that she was being ridiculous, paranoid, that babies needed to be exposed to germs to build immunity. But something deep inside her, something primal and unshakable, told her to trust her instincts. As another text message lit up her phone, this time from her best friend Kelly, asking why she hadn't responded about visiting, Sarah felt the familiar weight of guilt and anxiety settling on her shoulders. The pediatrician had been clear about limiting exposure during these early weeks, especially during cold and flu season. But how could she explain that to people who saw her caution as a personal rejection? Through the window, the snow continued to fall, and Sarah wished it would never stop. The doorbell rang, just as Sarah had finally gotten Emma to latch properly for her morning feeding. She ignored it, focusing instead on her daughter's tiny face, but moments later came the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the front door lock. Yoo-hoo, where's my favorite girls? Sarah's heart sank. Barbara. Her mother-in-law had insisted on having a spare key for emergencies, and apparently, Tuesday morning counted as one. "We're upstairs," Sarah called out weakly, hurriedly adjusting her nursing cover as Barbara's footsteps approached. She hadn't even had time to put on a proper shirt today, let alone brush her teeth. Barbara burst into the nursery wearing a bright red wool coat, bringing with her a blast of cold air and the overwhelming scent of department store perfume. "There's my precious angel." She made a beeline for Emma, arms already outstretched. "Barbara, please, she's feeding right now." Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. "And could you maybe wash your hands first? There's so much going around." "Oh, Sarah." Barbara's voice carried that familiar note of dismissal that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I raised 3 boys, you know. We didn't have all these rules back then, and they turned out just fine." She leaned in close, her face inches from Emma's head. "Didn't your daddy turn out just fine?" Emma pulled away from the breast, startled by the sudden proximity of this loud, perfumed presence. Her face scrunched up in preparation for a cry. See, she wants her grandma. Before Sarah could protest, Barbara had scooped Emma from her arms. The nursing cover fell away, leaving Sarah exposed and fighting back tears of frustration. "I just came from bridge club," Barbara continued, peppering Emma's face with kisses. "Everyone's dying to meet her. I told them we'd stop by next week." "That's not happening," Sarah said, finally finding her voice as she stood up, reaching for her daughter. "The pediatrician said." "The pediatrician?" In my day, we listened to our mothers, not some doctor who's probably never even had children. Barbara turned away slightly, keeping Emma just out of Sarah's reach. You're going to make her neurotic, keeping her locked up like this. A knock at the front door interrupted their standoff. Through the nursery window, Sarah could see her neighbor Clara's silver SUV in the driveway. Perfect, just perfect. Come in, Barbara called out before Sarah could object. Clara appeared moments later, her 3-year-old twins trailing behind her like noisy shadows. I saw Barbara's car and thought I'd pop in. Oh my goodness, is this little Emma? She reached out, running a finger along Emma's cheek. Tyler, Sophia, come see the baby. Sarah watched in horror as the twins, faces sticky with what looked like chocolate, crowded around Barbara and Emma. Actually, we were just finishing up feeding. Nonsense, Barbara bounced Emma slightly. She needs to get used to other children. Come on, kids, you can touch her. She's not going to break. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah felt like she was watching a slow-motion disaster she was powerless to stop. The twins took turns poking at Emma's face and hands. Clara kept trying to adjust Emma's clothes to get a better look at her. And Barbara continued to act as if she had sole authority over her granddaughter. When Emma finally began to cry real tears this time, Sarah managed to reclaim her, citing the need for a diaper change. She retreated to the changing table, her hands shaking as she went through the motions. Oh, speaking of diapers, Clara chirped, I have some leftover samples from when the twins were tiny. They're a different brand than what you're using, but you should try them. I'll run home and get them. Before Sarah could decline, Clara had disappeared, leaving her children behind with Barbara, who was now giving them a tour of the nursery Sarah and Mike had spent months perfecting. One of the twins, Tyler, was climbing on the rocking chair, his shoes leaving marks on the cushion. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Despite Sarah's increasingly direct texts asking for space, people kept showing up. Her cousin dropped by with her preschooler, who was just getting over a cold, but it's probably not contagious anymore. Kelly arrived with lunch and insisted on holding Emma while eating her sandwich, breadcrumbs falling onto the baby's blanket. Even the UPS delivery man had reached out to chuck Emma under the chin before Sarah could step back. By Friday evening, Sarah noticed Emma felt warmer than usual during her bath. Not quite a fever, but enough to send Sarah's anxiety spiraling. The baby was also fussier than normal, refusing to settle for her usual evening feeding. You're being paranoid, Mike said when she mentioned her concerns. He'd just returned from a business trip and was catching up on emails in the living room. Babies cry. It's what they do. Sarah watched Emma's face scrunch in discomfort as she tried to nurse, her tiny body squirming more than usual. A light sheen of sweat covered her forehead despite the room being cool. In her mind, Sarah could still see all those unwashed hands touching her daughter's face, all those uninvited kisses, all those moments where her maternal instinct screamed no but politeness had made her stay silent. Her phone buzzed with a text from Barbara Book Club. Ladies, can't wait to meet Emma tomorrow. We'll be there at 10. Don't worry about cleaning up, we know what it's like with a newborn. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, and felt something inside her break. This had to stop. But before she could compose a response, Emma's face contorted, and she let out a cry unlike anything Sarah had heard before, a harsh, barking sound that made her blood run cold. The night dissolved into a blur of terror. Emma's temperature climbed rapidly, hitting 101.4 dec by midnight. Her breathing became labored, each inhale accompanied by a wheeze that made Sarah's own chest tighten in sympathy. The barking cough that had started earlier now came in waves, leaving the baby exhausted and struggling to catch her breath. Mike, we need to go to the ER. Now Sarah's voice cracked as she cradled Emma, who felt like a furnace against her chest. Their daughter's usual rosy complexion had taken on a bluish tinge around her lips. For once, Mike didn't argue about her being overprotective. One look at Emma's distressed face had him grabbing car keys and their emergency bag. The drive to Children's Hospital was torture, each red light an eternity as Emma's breathing grew more labored in her car seat. Sarah's mind raced through the past week, each memory striking like a physical blow. Barbara's lipstick-stained kisses on Emma's cheeks. Clara's twins touching the baby's hands with their chocolate-covered fingers. Kelly eating over Emma while holding her. The neighbors' school-aged children who'd stroked Emma's face after Barbara invited them in to meet the baby each memory now felt like a personal failure, moments where she should have screamed no instead of smiling politely. The emergency room was chaos at 1 a.m., but Emma's temperature and breathing difficulties fast-tracked them through triage. A young doctor named Dr. Chen appeared almost immediately, her calm efficiency both reassuring and terrifying. "How long has she been having difficulty breathing?" Dr. Chen asked as she listened to Emma's chest. "The cough started this evening," Sarah answered, then hesitated. "But she's been fussy and warm since this afternoon. I should have brought her in sooner. I should have." "You brought her in exactly when you needed to," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. She frowned slightly as she examined Emma's nose and throat. "Has she been around anyone who's been sick? Any exposure to other children?" Sarah's voice shook as she recounted the parade of visitors, the unwanted touches, the ignored requests for hand washing. Each admission felt like a confession of maternal negligence. "It's presenting like RSV," Dr. Chen said, ordering immediate tests. "Respiratory syncytial virus. We're seeing a lot of cases this season." The next hour was a nightmare of medical interventions. Emma screamed weakly as they suctioned her nose and throat. Her oxygen levels weren't where they should be, leading to the placement of a tiny oxygen mask that made her look heartbreakingly fragile. Sarah stood by helplessly as they inserted an IV into her daughter's miniature veins, Mike's arm around her shoulders the only thing keeping her upright. The test results confirmed Dr. Chen's suspicion RSV. As the doctor explained the diagnosis, Sarah's mind flashed back to her pediatrician's warnings at Emma's first checkup. Limit exposure during cold and flu season. RSV can be very serious in newborns. She'd tried to follow those instructions, hadn't she? But every time she'd tried to protect Emma, someone had made her feel unreasonable, paranoid, overprotective. Will she? Sarah couldn't finish the question. "We're going to admit her," Dr. Chen said gently. "RSV can be serious in infants this young, but we caught it relatively early. She'll need close monitoring and support until the virus runs its course." As they waited for a bed in the pediatric unit, Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. She sank into a chair beside Emma's ear bed, tears streaming down her face. The beeping of monitors, the harsh hospital lighting, the antiseptic smell, it was all too reminiscent of Emma's birth just weeks ago. But this time, instead of joy and relief, she was drowning in guilt and fear. "I should have protected her better," she sobbed into Mike's chest. "I should have stood up to your mother, to everyone. I knew better. I knew they shouldn't all be touching her and kissing her, but I didn't want to make waves. I didn't want to be difficult." Mike, who had spent the past weeks telling her she was being too cautious, looked stricken. "This isn't your fault, Sarah. We both should have been more careful. I should have supported you more." A nurse came to transport them to the pediatric floor, where the reality of their situation became even clearer. Emma was placed in isolation, with everyone required to wear masks and gowns to enter the room. The same precautions Sarah had been labeled paranoid for wanting at home were now hospital protocol. Around dawn, Dr. Chen stopped by to check on them. Finding Sarah still awake, maintaining a tearful vigil by Emma's crib, she pulled up a chair. "I know you're blaming yourself," she said quietly, "but I want you to know something. We see this all the time, especially with first-time parents. The pressure to let everyone hold the baby, to not appear rude or overprotective, it's intense, and the consequences can be serious." She pulled out her tablet, showing Sarah statistics that made her blood run cold. RSV hospitalizations in infants under 6 months, complications from casual contact during cold and flu season, cases sparked by seemingly healthy older children or adults who were asymptomatic carriers. Just last week, we had twin newborns admitted with RSV after their older cousin insisted on kissing them at a family gathering. The week before that, it was a 3-week-old who got it from well-meaning church members who all wanted to hold her after the service. Dr. Chen's eyes were kind above her mask. "Your maternal instincts were right, Mrs. Walker. Society puts so much pressure on new mothers to be accommodating, to let everyone share in the joy of a new baby. But your job isn't to make everyone else happy. Your job is to protect your child." Emma stirred in her hospital crib, letting out another barking cough that seemed to rattle her tiny frame. Sarah reached through the bars to stroke her daughter's hot forehead, careful not to disturb the oxygen tubing or monitoring wires. The good news, Dr. Chen continued, is that most babies do recover from RSV with proper support. But this experience, use it. Let it give you the strength to set boundaries without guilt. Your instincts were trying to protect her. Listen to them. As if to emphasize the point, Emma's monitors began alarming, her oxygen levels dropping again. Sarah watched helplessly as nurses rushed in to suction her airways. Each tortured breath from her daughter feeling like punishment for every time she'd chosen politeness over protection. The next 5 days in the pediatric ward taught Sarah more about strength than she'd learned in all her 35 years. She watched Emma fight through each breath, celebrated small victories like a slight drop in temperature or an hour of uninterrupted sleep, and found herself growing stronger with each passing day. The constant stream of texts asking about visiting went unanswered. Mike had taken charge of family communications, finally understanding the importance of protecting their vulnerable daughter. On day 3, Emma's fever finally broke. Her breathing became less labored, though the horrible cough lingered. Sarah noticed her daughter's spark returning, those alert eyes tracking movement around the room once again. The nurses commented on her resilience, but Sarah could see the shadows of exhaustion on her baby's face. It was during one of Emma's rare, peaceful naps that Barbara showed up at the hospital, bursting into the room without any of the required protective gear. "They told me I had to wear all that silly equipment, but I knew you'd make an exception for Grandma," she announced, reaching for Emma. "I brought the ladies from Bridge Club to see her too. They're in the waiting room." Something snapped inside Sarah. She stepped between Barbara and the crib, drawing herself up to her full height. "Get out." Her voice was quiet but carried an steel edge that made Barbara step back. "You will not touch my daughter. You will not come near her without protection. And your Bridge Club, they can turn around and go home." "Now, Sarah." No, Sarah's hands were shaking, but her voice remained steady. "This is what listening to you got us. Every time you dismissed my concerns, every time you invited people over without asking, every kiss you planted on her with your lipstick, all of it could have contributed to this. Emma is fighting for every breath because people like you thought your right to hold her was more important than her health." Barbara's face flushed. "I would never hurt my granddaughter. I raised 3 children." "And times have changed," Mike interrupted, entering the room in full protective gear. "Mum, you need to leave. Now. If you want to visit, you follow the rules. All of them. No exceptions." The look of shock on Barbara's face would have been comical under other circumstances. She left in a huff, but Sarah barely noticed, already turning back to Emma, who had stirred at the noise. Over the next few days, as Emma grew stronger, Sarah found herself connecting with other mothers in the pediatric ward. There was Jenny, whose 6-week-old was recovering from pneumonia after a well-meaning cousin just couldn't resist kissing the baby. Maria, whose twins were fighting bronchiolitis after their daycare center had allowed sick children to attend. These women understood without explanation, offering support without judgment. A week after they'd rushed to the ER, Sarah and Mike finally brought Emma home. The house had been thoroughly cleaned, air purifiers installed in every room. A new sign hung on the front door. "Welcome to our home. No visits without prior approval. All visitors must wash hands and wear masks. No kissing the baby, but short visits only. If you're sick or have been around sick people, please visit another time. Thank you for helping protect our daughter." The Walkers. Meh. The first test of their new boundaries came the very next day when Clara appeared on their doorstep, twins in tow. "I saw you were home." The kids made Emma get well cards. "Thank you," Sarah interrupted firmly, not opening the screen door. "That's very thoughtful. But we're not accepting visitors right now. Emma's still recovering, and we need to be extra careful." "Oh, but we're practically family, and the kids have missed her so much." No, Sarah's voice was gentle but immovable. "When Emma's pediatrician clears her for visitors, we'll set up a time, and we'll have some new rules in place." Clara's face fell, but Sarah stood her ground. Behind her, Mike squeezed her shoulder in support. As weeks passed, they developed a new normal. Mike became Sarah's staunchest ally, running interference with his family and supporting her increasingly confident boundary setting. They found a new mothers group that emphasized health awareness and respect for parental choices. Several members had their own RSV stories, and Sarah's experience helped warn other first-time mothers about the importance of trusting their instincts. Barbara eventually came around, showing up one day with a mask already on and hands freshly sanitized. "I've been doing some reading," she admitted sheepishly. "And I'm sorry, I should have respected your rules." Sarah's heart softened slightly at the apology, though she maintained the visiting restrictions. As she watched her mother-in-law finally holding Emma properly protected, for a short, scheduled visit, she reflected on how much had changed. The old Sarah would have capitulated, would have risked her daughter's health to keep the peace. But that Sarah had been left behind in that hospital room, replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood that a mother's first duty was to protect her child, regardless of who she might offend in the process. Emma, now alert and healthy in her grandmother's arms, caught Sarah's eye and gave her one of her newly mastered smiles. In that moment, Sarah knew that every uncomfortable conversation, every enforced boundary, every refused visit had been worth it. Her daughter was worth it all. 1 year later, Emma's birthday party was in full swing, though it looked quite different from the typical first birthday celebration. Guests had been carefully selected, hand sanitizer stations dotted the backyard, and anyone with even a hint of a sniffle had been gently but firmly asked to stay home. Sarah watched from the patio as her healthy, thriving daughter giggled in her father's arms, showing off her 4 tiny teeth to an admiring but respectfully distanced audience. The past year had changed them all. That terrifying week in the hospital had transformed Sarah from an uncertain first-time mother into a confident advocate for her child. She'd learned that maternal instincts weren't just old wives' tales, they were evolution's way of protecting the most vulnerable among us. More importantly, she'd learned that being a good mother sometimes meant being uncomfortable, saying no, and standing firm in the face of social pressure. As Emma's delighted squeals filled the air, Sarah caught Barbara's eye across the yard. Her mother-in-law, now one of their strongest allies in maintaining boundaries, gave her a knowing smile. They'd come a long way from those early days of conflict. These days, Barbara was the first to remind other grandmothers about the importance of respecting a mother's rules. Looking at her daughter, healthy and strong on her first birthday, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. Yes, some had called her overprotective, difficult, even paranoid. But she knew now what she wished she'd understood in those early weeks: a mother's job wasn't to make everyone else comfortable. It was to protect her child, trust her instincts, and stand firm in that purpose no matter what anyone else might think. Emma toddled over, arms outstretched, and Sarah scooped her up, breathing in her baby scent. Some lessons came at a terrible price, but if their story could help even one other mother find her voice, it was worth sharing.